Being born into a toxic family isn't a curse. It is your training. I know how that sounds. It sounds like an excuse. It sounds like a justification for things that should never have happened. Because it hurt. It was confusing. It was unfair. You looked around and saw other kids with parents who adored them, protected them, people who were just normal. And you spent your whole life trying to understand, why me? You have spent a lifetime resenting the very soil you grew from. But what if I told you that pain wasn't an accident? What if this universe is intelligent enough to not make mistakes? What if it placed you, a sensitive, aware soul, into that exact fire, specifically to forge 3 spiritual superpowers within you? Superpowers that people with easy lives, people born into perfectly harmonious families, will simply never develop. We are not here today to curse the darkness. We are here to understand the light that it forced you to create. You see, we have this idea that spiritual awakening should come from pleasant experiences, from meditation retreats, or reading wise books, or sitting in beautiful gardens. And yes, those help. But true awakening, the kind that shakes you to your core, that comes from fire. That comes from having everything you thought you needed stripped away until all that's left is who you actually are. If you were born into a perfectly harmonious family where love flowed freely, would you ever question reality? Would you ever look deeper? Probably not. You would float along the stream, never knowing there was anything else. But a toxic family? They gave you friction. They gave you problems that couldn't be solved by normal means. They gave you situations you couldn't just go along with because what everyone else was doing was clearly insane. And in that friction, something began to wake up. That waking up isn't just a vague feeling. It is the creation of tangible abilities. The first, and perhaps the most vital, is what I call superpower number 1, the illusion detector. Think about this. Most people never question what love is. They just accept whatever their family taught them. If their family was distant, they assume love is distant. They repeat the pattern. But when you are born into toxicity, you don't have that luxury. The pattern is so obviously broken that you cannot repeat it. When the very word love is mixed with manipulation, with control, with conditions, with guilt, something inside of you rebels. Something inside you says, no, this isn't right. This is not love. In that moment of rejection, you took your first step, because now you had to go find out what real love actually was. You couldn't rely on what you were taught. You couldn't trust the programming. You had to go deeper. You had to discover what love meant when it wasn't mixed with all the garbage your family attached to it. What is this process? It is the building of a superpower. You were forced to become a detective of the human heart. You had to learn to look behind words. You had to learn to read energy. You had to learn to distinguish between what people said and what people did. People raised in easy love, they don't have this skill. They take words at face value. They trust easily. And while that is beautiful for them, they are also easily deceived. You are not easily deceived. You developed a built-in illusion detector. You can smell manipulation from a mile away. You can sense inauthenticity in a split second. You can sit in a room and feel the unspoken tension, the hidden agendas, the emotional lies that everyone else is pretending not to notice. This might have felt like a curse for a long time. Why am I so sensitive? Why do I overthink everything? You aren't overthinking. You are perceiving. You weren't just born sensitive. Your environment forced you to sharpen that sensitivity into a finely tuned instrument. You had to see things as they really were. And seeing things as they really were, that is the beginning of all wisdom. That is your first superpower. But this detector creates a new problem. When you see the illusions, when you see the pain, you also see the source of the pain. And this leads to the second superpower, the one that takes you from anger to peace. Superpower number 2, radical compassion. Let's use a metaphor. When a grain of sand gets inside an oyster, it irritates it. It hurts. The oyster cannot expel it. So what does it do? It begins to coat that irritating grain with layers of nacre, mother of pearl, slowly, patiently, and eventually that irritant becomes a pearl. The most beautiful thing the oyster creates comes from the thing that hurt it the most. Your toxic family is that grain of sand. For years, you were angry, and you had every right to be angry. The pain was real. The trauma was real. What happened to you was not okay. This isn't about excusing abuse. But as your illusion detector got stronger, you didn't just see the illusions in your family. You started to see their wounds. Here is a hard truth. Your family wasn't just toxic to you. They were toxic because they were broken. They were broken because their parents were broken. And their parents were broken because their parents were broken. It goes on and on, generation after generation, passing down the pain like a family heirloom because they didn't know any better. You are the culmination of all that pain. All those generational wounds, they all poured into you. And you are the one who finally said, "The buck stops here." You are the one who looked at the pattern and said, "No more." When you see this, truly see it, something extraordinary happens. The anger starts to dissolve. Not because you force it, not because you think you should forgive, but because you finally understand. You understand that they aren't evil villains. They are wounded people acting out of their wounds, incapable of doing anything else because no one ever showed them another way. This is radical compassion. It is radical because it isn't the shallow compassion of the easy life. People from easy lives, they often have a certain shallowness, don't they? They believe in fairy tales because their life was a fairy tale. They can't comprehend the darker aspects of existence. Their compassion is reserved for the good people, for the victims. Your compassion was forged in fire. It is a compassion that can look at the villain and see the wounded child inside. It is a compassion that can understand the perpetrator while still condemning the act. Now, this doesn't mean you have to have a relationship with them. It doesn't mean you trust them. It doesn't mean you let yourself be subjected to their toxicity. Understanding is not the same as enabling. Radical compassion is not about being a doormat. It is simply the ability to see the whole truth, to see the pain behind the anger, to see the fear behind the control. This is a God-tier superpower. It liberates you. It unhooks your soul from the chains of resentment, and it is the only thing that truly breaks the ancestral cycle. But this compassion, this understanding, is useless if you don't have the third superpower. This is the one that takes you from victim to master. This is the one people from easy lives struggle with the most. Superpower number 3, unbreakable boundaries. Let's look at people from healthy families for a second. They often struggle with this. They feel guilty saying no. They feel selfish prioritizing their own needs. Why? Because they were taught to confuse love with sacrifice. They were taught that to be a good person, you keep the peace, you accommodate. You learned a different lesson, didn't you? You learned it the hard way. You learned that love without boundaries isn't love. It is self-abandonment. You learned that true love includes boundaries, that true love sometimes means saying no, that true love sometimes means walking away, not with anger, not with hatred, but simply with a clear, calm understanding. This situation is not good for me, and I have the absolute right to choose situations that are good for me. This is spiritual maturity. This is something most people spend lifetimes trying to learn, and you learned it early because you had no choice. Your family gave you a brutal masterclass in what love is not. And in learning that, you were forced to learn what love is. Your boundaries are unbreakable, not because they are aggressive, but because they are conscious. They are no longer a desperate reaction to pain. They are a calm, deliberate choice based on your wisdom. You know that protecting yourself isn't hate. You know that drawing a line isn't cruel. You know that you can wish someone well while wishing them well from a very long distance away. This is the freedom that comes from your past. You learned how to love without attachment. You learned how to care without being consumed. You learned how to see people clearly without judgment. You had to. You had to do all of this with your own blood just to survive. And in doing so, you became a master. So let's go back to the start. Why you? Why the sensitive soul in the harshest soil? Because a tree doesn't grow strong by being kept in a greenhouse. It grows strong by being bent by the wind, by having to reach for the light, by having to send its roots deep just to keep from being blown over. The wind isn't kind, the wind is just the wind. But without it, the tree would never develop its strength. Your family was the wind, and you, whether you knew it or not, have been growing roots that go down so deep, roots that most people never have to grow. And those roots, that is your illusion detector. That depth, that is your radical compassion. That strength, that is your unbreakable boundaries. This is why you were chosen. Not because you are special in some ego way, but because your soul was strong enough to say, I will carry this weight. I will be the one who breaks the chain. Here is the great secret. The most spiritually awake people, they almost all had difficult childhoods. Not because suffering is noble, but because of the questioning that suffering creates. When life is easy, you don't ask questions. But when the people who are supposed to love you hurt you, you start asking big questions. Why am I here? What is this all about? What is real and what is an illusion? Your family pushed you to ask these questions early. They pushed you to develop an inner life because the outer life was too painful. And in developing that inner life, you found your true self. Not the self your family wanted, but your authentic self. You had to dig deep because the surface was unbearable. And in digging deep, you struck gold. Your awakening isn't just for you. It is for the generations before you, because in healing yourself, you heal the ancestral line. And it is for the generations that come after you, because you broke the mold. You stopped the cycle. You said, the madness ends with me. This is what it means to be spiritually awake. Not to be better than anyone else, but to be awake enough to see the patterns, strong enough to break them, and brave enough to choose differently. Your toxic family was the darkness that forced you to find your own light. They were the problem that forced you to become the solution. They were the question that forced you to become the answer. So yes, it was a gift. Not because the toxicity was good, but because it forced you to become who you really are. It forced you to wake up when you might have slept through your entire life. You didn't just survive, you transmuted. And that alchemy, that is the great gift. This is why you were placed exactly where you were placed. Not to suffer, but to awaken. Not to be broken, but to become whole. Not to repeat the pattern, but to transform it.